So it is really good to see you. I'm glad that you're here today. I know we got a lot of folks who are traveling, so if you're on fall break somewhere and you're watching, we're glad that you're watching the live stream. And if you have your Bible, I want you to turn to Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7. While you're turning there, I want to tell you about a particular place that I've been reading about this last week. It sits 20 miles to the south of Salt Lake City. It's the picturesque community of Draper, Utah. I've got a picture of it, kind of a drone shot that you can see. It's nestled in the far southeast corner of what's called the Salt Lake Valley. And it is surrounded to the east and the south by two different mountain ranges, which you can kind of get a sense of that as you look at the picture. And because of the differences in elevation between the valley and the mountain ranges around it, they have these incredibly strong winds that blow through. And so because of that, Draper, Utah has become the number one destination in America for people who are into, hang gliding and paragliding and all that kind of thing. Because of that, the little community has experienced explosive growth. Back in 1990, the population of Draper, Utah was just under 7,000. Today, it sits at 55,000. Because of that, one of the huge challenges they've had to deal with has been this ongoing housing crisis as they've struggled to keep up with the demand as people have moved there. One of the key players in the housing industry in Utah is a guy named Sean Bingham. He's the founder and CEO of a company called Edge Homes. Now, just as a side note, if you ever seen the ABC show Shark Tank, Sean Bingham was on there in season 10 and actually sold part of his company to one of the investors. Since then, they've become one of the largest developers in Utah. And one of their largest developments is just outside Draper, Utah, and it's called Hidden Canyon Estates. I've got a picture of what the homes look like in this. They run anywhere from $350,000 to $500,000, just in case you're planning on relocating to Utah. For the first couple of years, people were buying the homes faster than they could build them. That all changed, though, at the end of last year when inspectors from the city of Draper, Utah, declared some of the homes in the development unfit for human habitation, and they ordered dozens of families to vacate their homes. And there were some lawsuits that were sort of flying back and forth, and you can imagine how that went. But as it turns out, the inspectors from the city of Draper were correct. And it's a good thing they did what they did, because on April 21st of 2023, two of the homes in the development collapsed into a canyon that sits below the development. So I've got a picture of what this looked like. One of the owners of one of the homes told a local reporter, she said, "We kept hoping it wasn't going to end up like this. I visualized a lot of things for our lives in this home, and they were all wonderful and beautiful. But looking at this now, it's a nightmare." And you can kind of look at that and say, yeah, that would be a nightmare. Now here's the question. Have you ever had a dream that turned into a nightmare? Or have you ever been counting on something that you were sure was going to be a wonderful and beautiful experience, only to have to stand back and watch as it all came crashing down? This morning, we're continuing our series, Flourish. We've been working our way through the Sermon on the Mount. We've been trying to look at some ways of what Scripture says about real happiness or soul happiness. It's the kind of happiness that's not dependent on what's happening around you, but rather it's meant to flow out of what God is doing in you. So we've been kind of working our way, hitting some of the highlights of the Sermon on the Mount. And you get to the end of this in Matthew chapter 7, and Jesus concludes this sermon by drawing some pretty sharp contrasts. First, he talks about the narrow road as opposed to the broad road. Then he talks about true prophets versus false prophets. And then it's true disciples as opposed to to false disciples. And then you get to verse 24, he tells this incredible story about two men who both go through the process of building, their forever home. They're building their house. And for one of the guys, it turns out it's a beautiful and wonderful experience. For the other guy, it's a dream that turns into a nightmare. So if you have your Bible open, I want you to look at this with me. Matthew 7, verse 24. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. Now, what I want to do is give you three really simple reminders from this story that you probably have already heard, you already know, but it's good to be reminded, and then give you one statement at the end that hopefully ties it all together. So if you're tracking with us, here's the first reminder that comes directly from this story. It's that everyone is in the building process. Now, I know some of you have built houses, some of you may be building houses right now, but one of the ways to read this story is whenever you see Jesus talking about somebody building a house, just take out the word house and insert the word life. Because when he's talking about a person building a house, he's just using a metaphor for a person who's actually building their life. And all of us do that. You're building your life. I'm attempting to build my life, and that's just how it works. So how do you do that? How do you build a life? Well, if you think about it in terms of building a house, let's just say that you were going to build a brick house. And the only way to do that is to just build it brick by brick. So I brought this brick with me to try to illustrate this. I want you to imagine that you're building a brick house. And it's just a normal house, right? So don't think about like, your mansion on the hill that you're saving towards. Just a normal house. 3 bedrooms, couple bathrooms, maybe 2,000 square feet. So I looked it up this week. And if Google is correct, which, everything on the internet you read is true, that means that somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 bricks is what it would take to cover the exterior of a normal, 2,000 square foot house. But remember, what Jesus is talking about is not building a house. He's talking about building your life. And so how do you do that? Well, one way to think about it is that each individual brick is like a decision that you've made. So every decision you make becomes a brick that you stack up in this structure that you call your life. So the decisions that you make on a daily basis all become part of your story, which means they all become part of your life. So there's a researcher from Columbia University who studied this, and she concluded that the average person, and again, you may be more than this, you may be less than this, but the average person makes somewhere around 70 decisions a day. Now, admittedly, some of those decisions are made subconsciously, right? So you just sort of do them. You don't have to think about it. They just sort of happen. But then there are other things that you run into in the course of a day where you do have to, weigh the options and make some kind of decision. But if you add it all up, 70 decisions a day over 365 days equals 25,550 bricks that all become part of the life that you're building. But here's what happens, and some of you have already reached a point in life where you think about this, so you know this is true. Over time, with each passing year, those bricks begin to pile up. So it was 1993, and then it was 2006, and now it's 2023, and a couple days from now, it'll be 2028, and all of those bricks, all of those decisions that you've made have continued to stack up, and that's what's become your life. That's how you write your story, and that's what becomes your life. There's a writer named Gretchen Rubin. She calls this the invisible architecture of everyday life. This idea that over time, the decisions you make begin to pile up. And so if you live to be 80 years old, which is just a round number, that means you will have made somewhere around 2 million decisions. Kind of makes you tired when you think about it like that. 2 million decisions, and each of them will become like a brick that's part of this structure that you're building that you call life. Now it leads to the second reminder that you see in the story, and it's that whenever you're building, the storms of life are inevitable. They always come. So you get to verse 24, Matthew 7, Jesus says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who builds his house on the rock." So that's what we're all trying to do. Then you get to verse 25. "The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew, and they beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it's had its foundation on the rock." So you got this guy who builds his life, he builds his house, he's done a pretty good job, and then the storms eventually come. But interestingly enough, you keep reading, the storms also come to the other guy. There's this other guy who built his house in a different location, and the same storms that affected the guy who did the right thing also affect the guy who made some poor decisions. It's a good reminder. Doesn't matter what you do, good or bad, the storms are part of the deal. They always come. Earlier in Matthew 5, Jesus said the rain falls on the righteous and the unrighteous, meaning that eventually storms come to everybody. Thankfully, sometimes it's not a huge deal. Sometimes it's just a light sprinkle or kind of a summer shower, right? So it's frustrating, but it's not devastating. So you're driving down the road and the check engine light comes on in your car and you call the mechanic and you can't get in for 2 months. It's frustrating. It's not devastating. Or maybe one of your kids gets in some trouble at school and the teacher calls and says, "Hey, when you get a chance, could you stop by here? We need to talk to you." Or maybe you get an unexpected bill in the mail and you have to dip into your savings to pay for it. Or maybe it's something as simple as you look around your house and there's some things that really need some attention. You know, the paint is peeling and the roof is leaking and the doors squeak and the carpet looks worn and the air conditioner sounds like it's doing weird stuff and you don't have any idea how you're going to pay for all that, but you don't have to do it necessarily right now, so you got time to formulate a plan. Other times, though, rather than a light sprinkle, it can be more like a Category 5 hurricane. So you finally get the test results and you find out that it's stage 4 cancer. Or one of the corporate executives that you've never seen before shows up at your job and lets everybody know that your place is closing down. Or maybe rather than getting in some minor trouble at school, one of your kids gets arrested and the charges are pretty serious. A bad diagnosis, an unexpected downsizing, a nasty divorce, a financial set. All those things can be like a hurricane that kind of blows in your life and the intensity keeps picking up, and the longer it goes, you can feel the wind blowing and the water rising, and it feels like it's going to rip your life apart. And sometimes that's the way it works. But there's something else about these storms, and it's that each storm reveals the strength of the foundation. That's the third reminder you see in the story. It's that storms always reveal the strength of whatever it is that you've built. So I got another picture I want to show you. One of the most popular shows on HGTV is the show House Hunters. It debuted in 1999, and since then it's continued to be really popular, giving birth to lots of different spinoffs. And I'll be honest, I am not a fan. I've never really gotten into this because I've always had a hard time understanding how like a preschool ballet teacher and an art museum volunteer, have a $40 million budget. You know what I mean? And I'm not bitter about that. So if you want, you want to watch it, you feel free. But the way this works, if you've seen one episode, you've seen every episode because they're all the same. So you have this couple, and they're ready to find their dream house, their forever house, whatever it is. So they meet with this this realtor in the beginning, and they say, here's what we're looking for, and here's the 4 or 5 things, and just so you know, we got an unlimited budget to work with, and the realtor takes them out, and they show them 3 properties, and the cameras sort of follow them around. Again, I've never seen this, but they kind of follow them around, and they capture these conversations. And so the woman says, I really like the colors in this house. And the guy says, yeah, but the layout on this other house is really good. And she says, yes, but this other house will give us more room for entertaining. He comes back with, yeah, but there's a lot more storage on this other house. And that's kind of the way it goes until finally the woman decides which house they're going to make an offer on. The guy kind of reluctantly goes along with it, and that's kind of how it works. And again, my experience with this is very limited. But one of the things I noticed in almost every show I've seen is that all the conversations in the show revolve around like the cosmetic issues, right? And maybe that's just for the cameras. I mean, maybe they talk about other stuff when the cameras aren't rolling. But it seems to me the only thing they ever talk about is like, here's the paint colors, and here's the flooring options, and here's what the countertops look like, and maybe even they talk about the landscaping. But they never, ever, at least to my knowledge, talk about the things that make a house worth living in. You know what I mean? They don't talk about, did the person framing the house actually know what they were doing? Or is the wiring, throughout the house, is that up to code, or is that just something somebody pulled together? Is the basement actually waterproof, and how is there? I mean, they don't talk about those things. It's all about the paint colors and the countertops and the landscaping. The other thing that you never hear them talk about, which according to Jesus is the most important thing when it comes to a house, is the strength of the foundation. So one of the things that strikes me about this story that Jesus tells is that the assumption is that from a distance, both of these houses look the same. Like the color scheme might be different, and the landscaping, might look a little bit different. But just from a distance, you can't really tell any different, except there's one big difference that makes all the difference. In that part of the world, even today, when somebody builds a house, the temptation is always to dig down into the sand far enough where you can reasonably hope that when the storms come, it will support the weight of the structure that you're building. And the reason people do it that way is because it's cheaper and it's faster. But the other option, which according to Jesus, who himself was a builder or a carpenter, is to dig down into the rock that sits below the layer of sand, and you anchor your foundation in something solid so that when the storms do come and the waters do rise, your foundation will hold strong. Now, over the last few weeks, we've been talking about some of these false foundations that Jesus brings up in the Sermon on the Mount, and you know what they are. They're things that a lot of people, including some of us, have tried to build our lives on, only to discover that when the storms come, they have a way of collapsing. So for a lot of people, just as the video said, it's money and acquiring certain possessions, and then you get all that, and you quickly discover how fast your fortunes can be lost and possessions can be stolen. And even if you do all that, there's still some problems that money can't solve, and other problems that having a lot of money creates. But it's not just money. There are a lot of other foundations that people try to build their lives. Some people try to build their lives on acquiring a certain level of power, and their whole life becomes about, if I can just hang on. That explains why every time you turn on the news, the average age of our political leaders continues to climb. Do you know why? Because it's hard to walk away from power. Other people built their lives on accomplishments or fame or attention they get from other people. Some people, and people like this, it's all about their physical appearance and how they look. And then somewhere along the line, they figure out that, time is undefeated, and the wrinkles start to appear, and the hair starts to change colors, and the muscles get a little bit stiffer, and you realize that this foundation that you thought was going to carry you to the end has proven to be inadequate. And so you get to the end of verse 27. And Jesus talks about this guy who built his house on the wrong foundation. When the storms came, like they always do, his entire house, or his entire life, if you read this story the way Jesus told it, comes down with what Jesus calls a great crash. And as soon as you heard that, some of you thought back to some of the great crashes that you've lived through. So there was that relationship that you were counting on that ended unexpectedly. There was that business that you started that you were certain was going to take you to the promised land, and instead you wound up in bankruptcy court. There was that friend that you were sure would always have your back until the moment they stabbed the knife in it, and then just to make sure you got it, they twisted that knife once it was in there. I was reading about this this week. You know, every time there's a hurricane, there's a committee of 6 people that give a name to that hurricane. You've seen this, and they even name the tropical storms, and they always give it the name of a person. So it's Hurricane Hillary, Hurricane Nicole, Hurricane Lee, Hurricane Ian, and it goes right on down the alphabet. And maybe that's how it is for you. Maybe every time you think about one of those crashes that you've lived through, there's a name of a person that's attached to that. Because some of you know what it's like to go through a great crash. And yet when you look at this story that Jesus told, he tells us that there's a way for us to live. There's a way that you can build your life where that doesn't happen. Now, you can't avoid the storms, but you can avoid the crashes. And it comes down to one thing. So here's sort of the statement. I hope brings it all together. It's that hearing plus practice equals stability. So again, hearing plus practice equals stability. One of the things that's always haunted me about this story is that these 2 dudes that Jesus talks about, they seem to have a lot in common. And I can't prove any of this, so don't say, well, my Bible doesn't say that. I can't prove this, but at least the way I read this story, you have these 2 guys. And let's just say, for the sake of the illustration, that these 2 guys grew up together. Now, most of the villages in that little area in and around Jerusalem were pretty small, at least in terms of population. So it's very likely these guys, if they did grow up in the same little village, they probably not only knew each other, they probably hung out together. You know, they went to the same school, played on the same teams, hung out in the same places, and then as they got older, you know, they did what everybody does. They started their careers, they fell in love, and it came time for them to build their houses, to build their forever homes. And again, I can't prove this, but it's very possible that if this is all true and they grew up in the same little area, that these 2 guys probably built their houses close to each other. I mean, it only makes sense if your buddies around, hey, let's at least build in the same subdivision, if not on the same street. But here's the thing that scares me most about this story. The way Jesus tells it, it's very likely these 2 guys went to the same church. Jesus says that both of these guys heard his words. So they're sitting in the same church, they're listening to the same sermons, they're singing the same songs, they may have even attended the same Bible study. So Jesus makes it clear that both of these guys had heard, both of these guys had access to the same information. And the same thing is true of us today. I mean, we've got more access now to more information, more, biblical information than any generation in history. There are free Bible commentaries. You can get a study Bible. You can go on YouTube, and there'll be, some great theologian, and you can do a Q&A, and you can listen to him explain everything that you've ever wondered about. If that's not enough, you can download enough sermon. You can listen to different preachers 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you can get every perspective. And if you still want to go deeper, there's all kinds of podcasts. I mean, you can do anything you want to. We've got more access to more information than we've ever had before. So for us, for people living in 2023, hearing is not our problem. In fact, as soon as we started this today, some of you thought, well, I've heard this before. And you know what? You're right. You have. We've all heard this story. Our issue is the same issue that the second guy in this story struggled with, and that's that we don't always put into practice what we hear. So back when I was in college, there was this option you had if you were interested in a class, but either you didn't need the credit or it didn't fit with your degree program. So, for example, maybe you were an engineering major, but there was a history class you were interested in. You could do what was called auditing the class. So you could go to the class, you could take all the notes, you could listen to all the lectures. When class was over, you were expected to keep up with the reading assignments. So in that sense, you had access to all the same information that somebody else would have had who was taking the class for credit. The only difference was because you weren't taking it for credit, you didn't have to take the exams. So somebody else has to do all this work. You're free to take in all the information, but you don't ever actually have to put any of it into practice because you're not taking the test. For you, you're just downloading information. So I mentioned earlier that as Jesus comes to the end of this sermon, he draws some pretty sharp contrast. You go back to verse 21, immediately before he tells the story we looked at, he contrasts people who are truly following Jesus with people who are only pretending to follow Jesus. I want you to look at how he says, verse 21, he says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who's in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' Then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.'" So again, you got two groups of people, both enrolled in the same class, both attending the same lectures, both reading the same books, both participating in the same class activities. And then when it comes time for the final exam, one group of students passed and another group of students failed. And the only difference is that the people who passed took what they heard, they put it into practice, while the other group was content to take in all the information but never actually do anything with it. And instead, just like some of us, they let it go in one ear and out the other. So the question then is, which group are you in? Now, I know like you've heard the words of Jesus, right? Some of you heard them your entire life. You can't remember a time when you didn't hear them. But for some of you, up until this point, it's kind of been like you're auditing the class. So you've got all the information, you've read all the material, but you've never really done anything with it. You've never decided whether or not you want to be a follower of Jesus or if you just want to be somebody who knows a lot of stuff about Jesus. And just so you know, that's the mistake that the guy in our story made. He had all the right information, but because he refused to put any of it into practice, eventually his entire life came crashing down around him. But Jesus says it doesn't have to be that way. There's another option. There's a better option. So rather than allowing Jesus' words to go in one ear and out the other, we all have the option of taking his words, applying them to our lives, and then building our life on the foundation of what he said. And then when the storms do come, just like the first guy in our story, we can discover that because we've built on a solid foundation, we're not just able to survive, but we can actually flourish regardless of the intensity of the storm that's taking place around us. So I want to go back to a picture that I showed you earlier. 48 hours after the collapse of these two homes, the owner of the company, Sean Bingham, finally released a vaguely worded statement. to the Salt Lake Tribune. Here's what he said. Despite all the engineering and quality control efforts, the retaining wall and the hillside slope experienced a complete failure. We became aware of certain structural problems a few months ago, but the winter conditions amplified the problems and prevented us from stabilizing homes. Now, you hear that, you think, yeah, I can kind of see that. I mean, I know something went wrong. But it's what he said next in his statement that caused a lot of people to scratch their head, and they wondered what he was getting. Here's what he said. Was this a design failure by the engineers? Was this a construction failure by the excavators and the retaining wall companies? Was this a combination of both or neither? We simply cannot answer these questions today. Now, you hear that. It sounds like he's trying to shift the blame, right? I mean, it couldn't possibly be that building homes on the edge of a canyon is not a good idea, right? It has to be that somebody else, although it couldn't be that the foundational thing, the location of where I'm trying to build, it couldn't be that that's this one decision that's going to set off this chain reaction of events that's going to end with people losing their homes. So earlier I told you that every decision you make is like a brick that stacks up in your life. And every brick is important, but there are some bricks, and you know this if you've ever been involved in any kind of building project, there are some bricks, there are some decisions that are more important than others. In masonry, they're called cornerstones. Bricklayers sometimes call them coins. A coin is where these two walls intersect in a corner, and they'll put bricks in there to build up those walls to provide stability to the entire structure. So I was talking to Derek Phillips about this week, and I said, what happens if one of those coins gets damaged or gets removed? Or what happens if one of those cornerstones, if that's the word you're familiar with, gets removed? And guess what happens? The whole thing crashes. And so there's some bricks and some decisions that you can't just stack up on others. Like, they are so important that if you get them wrong, it doesn't matter what you try to stack on top of them, eventually it's all going to crash. And so when you read through Scripture over and over again, the New Testament writers say there's only one cornerstone that can bear the weight of the life that you're trying to build. And it's not any of the stuff that we tend to obsess over. Instead, it's a relationship with Jesus. So with that in mind, I want you to stand with me, and the band's going to come, and I just want you to ask yourself, have I built my life on the right foundation? And if you haven't, today would be a good day to start the rebuilding process. So we're going to sing a couple songs. And as we do, if you have questions about what this would look like, if you have questions about how to even get started, we'd love to talk with you. Be glad to pray with you and to walk alongside of you. Some of you are here, I know this because I know you. You have spent your entire life hearing these stories, thinking about the things that Jesus said. And if I handed you, even without the Bible, if I said, hey, tell me the story about the two guys that built their house, you could have told the story probably better than I did, but you've never made a commitment to actually follow Jesus. It's always been just learning more about Jesus. And there's a huge difference, as Matthew 7 says. So if that's you and you want to talk to somebody, we'd be honored to talk with you. Maybe a few of you here who have been coming for a while and you're ready to make this your church home, we'd be glad to walk you through that process. So as we sing these songs, whatever you need to do, meet David and I down here. We'll be glad to walk you through it.